Hey guys, welcome back to the Buff Nerd Podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Mr. Brett Wilson.
I don't know how special that is. Hi,
Hey,
thank you
you're
for
a good
having me.
friend of mine, so it's something special. Not too many people get to that stage.
Yeah, fair enough, my man. Fair enough. I appreciate
It
it.
sounds like a jerk.
Oh, well, there you go.
There we go.
Just goes to show you nothing is perfect in Hollywood. But anyway,
Doesn't need to be perfect. So Coleman, first and foremost, I know a lot about you, but let's let the people know about Mr. Wilson.
Oh,
Where are you
wow.
from, man?
That is a phenomenal question. I've moved about 20 times now. So I was born in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale, and then have just moved around a ton, like with my family, like my parents, and then I did a decent amount of moving myself, and I also lived here before. So I lived here back in 2008 and moved around Southern California a little bit. So yeah, man,
Why are you moving so much?
What you doing? You selling drugs? No, I'm just kidding. No, I think first half of my life really was dedicated just to like family, like pushing us around. Like my dad had different opportunities, and that led us down a couple of different paths. My mom had a couple of things that kind of tweaked to like where we were, but for me, it really was more so went to college in D.C. and then kind of stopped going to college for a while. And then I moved out here, and then stopped doing that and we can get into this maybe at another time a little bit later. I was homeless for a little bit, and then ended up moving back in
Yeah, the plot thickens. I
You're
didn't
right.
know that.
Ended up moving back in with the folks, and got resituated, got a job, worked full time, went back to college, got my degree, and then spent a few years living and working in Chicago, and then I eventually took another opportunity that got me from Chicago out to the Phoenix area, so in Arizona, and then I moved from there to here right around the same time that my wife got pregnant, but we weren't married at that time. We got married shortly thereafter, even though we were supposed to originally have got married November of like last year, but we got married January of last year.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then now I got a little boy who's 11 months and is gonna be 1 in a few weeks.
Cool, man.
So yeah, man, that's the whole gig for the people, if you will.
Well, so what I really want. Okay, like I said, I know about a lot about you, but I'm trying to really understand. Like I want to, mainly because pretty much every time we talk, you drop some little nugget of wisdom on me out of nowhere.
I don't know about that.
And a lot of the times, it has kind of the tone of like a rapper or something.
What?
DJ.
So what rapper am I supposed to be? Now I'm curious.
Mr. Wilson.
Mr.
No, but so I'm gonna dig a little deeper into that.
Okay.
Like, you said you went to college for a little bit and then stopped.
Yep.
Like, what were you studying? Like,
Yep. So I actually studied the same thing both times. So I studied history. I would say probably 20th century American history is about the closest you could get, although my senior thesis was on something totally different. It was situated on basically, if you think about the American educational system as it stands today, so like obviously like with our job, we work like K through 12, like it actually was based off of this guy, John Locke, and he had a whole system that he had put in place, and it coincides with Aesop's fables and like a bunch of other stuff. So basically he was, tutoring and teaching all of these other rich families from, here in the United States, also in Europe, mostly kind of in London and everything else where he was originally based. But it was kind of the cross section of everything that we think about, the way that classrooms are set up and the way teachers interact with students and the way everything, even though a lot of that's changing now, like that was, a lot of it's actually attributed to him. So it was super interesting and something I ended up having the, pleasure to write on. And I thought I was going to be at some level of a historian, possibly a professor. But I shadowed a couple of my professors. I figured out that was not for me. So it didn't quite go down that path. But
I have to know, like, first of all, why history, and second of all, why American history? Because for me, as a young black man in America, I was like, anytime I delved into American history, it didn't make me too happy. Growing up as a kid, now I'm more interested in it, but like I was not trying to hear any of that when I was.
So just as a sidebar, are we good to curse on this podcast?
Fuck yes.
Okay,
I haven't yet, but
all right.
it's not
Well,
against
no,
the rules.
I'm just thinking maybe for future parts of the conversation or whatever, I'd like to just get that out of the way.
Yeah, feel free to swear away.
Children, it's time for you to tune out, go to bed, play in the sandbox, do something else. No, I think when it came down to history, I just was always like, I don't know, even like growing up, it was a lot harder to be able to get into like the nuts and bolts of almost any other, you know, hobby like growing up. So that is possibly a system of moving around a lot. Like, you know, you have your parents, but you don't necessarily have that same, you know, great, you know, cohesion or collection of people that come together with like, oh, you know, I had tons of brothers. I was the only child growing up. So like, you know, it wasn't like, oh, I had tons of brothers and sisters, or, you know, I had all these cousins and all this other stuff that was around all the time. So, you know, I had my interests, got into music super early, loved video games, all the same stuff that, you know, most other kids like end up doing. But the one thing I ended up doing like as a kid is I read a lot. And more so than anything, my mom's mother, so, you know, maternal grandmother, big time into politics and much of other stuff. She also was a school teacher, and she has a very long and interesting story I'll regale you with at another time. But anyway, she was super huge into history, like pretty much all my grandparents, now that I really think about it. But it just kind of runs in my family. History, storytelling, having a very unique understanding of, you know, we'll say like as African Americans, as Black people, like where we come from, you know, how our experiences are shaped by, you know, the history we've had in the U.S. And it just kind of pushed me to a place by the time I got to college, I was so uniquely interested in just knowing that much more about, like, you know, turning things over and understanding, you know, not just like this weird conspiracy stuff, like where are all the bodies buried, but, you know, but really like being able to just, you know, deconstruct certain things, understand that, you know, when people use certain euphemisms or when they talk about, you know, Black people in a certain way, or, you know, even the significance of something like an example of like Birth of the Nation, right? So just to not get in this huge little tangent, but like a small thing, Birth of the Nation, one of the, you know, original super transformative, but also very uniquely racist, you know, silent films from the earlier part of the 20th century. It was so provocative, and so much so that it actually depicted, and many people believe it was kind of the precursor to what eventually became the Ku Klux Klan. So anyway, it was something that was so pivotal that Woodrow Wilson, who was our president at that time, I believe it was 1912, if I'm not mistaken, and he actually had a showing of Birth of the Nation at the White House and said that it was this huge pivotal film. And if you're not familiar with it, it is something where they basically have a central character, and that central character is supposed to be, you know, a Black individual, or who they would, you know, turn to be like as an African American, set during Civil War time, and he basically kind of, you know, broke out and goes and rapes this white woman, and then the Ku Klux Klan comes in, riding in to come, you know, save the day. So it's this, you know, white supremacy, the overall hegemony that, you know, kind of put us in a certain place, you know, in American history, and ended up, you know, having us be a pretty divided, malaffected society for, well, still pretty much is that way now, but that's not the point. I think my whole, you know, interest or kind of focus is it helps me to be able to better inform others and myself of where I come from, what sort of stance I have, and also just have a better understanding of how, you know, I play party to anything that's going on around me. So the better I understand, you know, the history of not just my family and where I come from, but the history of this country in particular, it really helps me to be able to see and gather information in a way that's going to be conducive to me treating people in a way that's, you know, fair and upstanding and upright. I obviously now have another life to be considerate of. So I have my son, and there'll be a lot of things that I'll have to talk with him about and teach him, and things that we'll have to do. And, you know, so it always, you know, was something that was always very interesting to me, but I always viewed it from a, you know, high level of importance as well. So, I mean, that was probably why I gravitated to history like pretty quickly. Plus, you know, I was a book nerd growing up. Did nothing but read, man. Yeah, and the history books are long, so less time to have to bug my parents or anybody else if I'm sitting there with a big old book in front of my face.
Yeah, I mean, I guess again, I'm more interested in history than I was as a kid. Like as a kid, I just thought it was boring, and probably because I was more into video games and like getting that super high level of excitement all the time. That any time I was just in like a relaxed state, I just associated that with being bored, and it was really hard for me to get excited about history. And the only times I did get excited, it was like an excitement of anger, like just
yeah.
But like I, instead of diving into history, started diving more into myself.
Okay.
Like the foundational components of myself, the things that made me who I was, and it was like very surface level stuff when I was a kid, but it's developing more and more as I get older, and so I'm just wondering how your interest in history and your pursuit of mastery of history like translates to you becoming a better person, because you mentioned that a little bit, like wanting to learn how to treat people in different situations.
Yeah, man. I would say that the older I get and the more that I actually read, it helps to better inform my opinion on things. Now, I think I actually, coincidentally enough, I read a lot, and so I read a lot of news articles, I read a lot of books, I listen to a lot of podcasts, I consume data and information in various different ways. In the way that that's helpful, especially like from what I view as a historical perspective, is it teaches me that I have this unique ability to be able to parse out information, like you and I are sitting across from each other having a conversation, and based on how I feel about you or perceive you, and your personality and how all that comes together, that's great and good. And I feel like we're friends, and I trust you, and we can have this great conversation. We can go as deep as you want, and everything's great. But when you start to extend yourself into the greater part of society, or go out, aside of that, like, it's a lot harder. The New York Times has a spin. Alex Jones and InfoWars, they have a spin. He has an agenda. Like, they have things that they want to express. So people who are all the way out here in academia on the one side, and the people who are all out here on the exact opposite end of the spectrum for things that is really truly opinionated. So even beyond like the op-ed, because even editorials have to have people who kind of come in and question like their motive, their thesis, and like what they have to say. Like, we're talking about people just purely or just shoving their opinion in front of people's faces. How are you able to really determine what's important, what they're being influenced by, and what sort of message are they actually sending by disseminating certain types of information? And some of that just comes from just trying to get as many of these sources around the same topic as possible, and then being able to try and figure out, okay, well, now where's my foundation? So I'll give you an example of like the law. So law system in this country, not perfect, but on its face, it's designed to be able to work within the framework of things where we set precedents. So we come to certain legal decisions at some point in time, and then once that legal decision is accepted, you're able to then utilize that to a certain extent into the foreseeable future as a preset precedence. So that precedence allows for you to be able to say, well, this person and this judge and these other people in this particular instance decided that this idea bore its way out through all of this argument, evidence, and then subsequently coming to a concrete decision on that. And then we can use our massive brains to be able to figure out how we want to reframe that and start to figure things. History works much in the same way. So now I look at things in terms of anything that's going on in the news. So there's a traffic stop, somebody gets killed. Now, I know that there's slightly different laws, in all parts of the country, but for the most part, you don't just have the ability to go out and shoot somebody just because you feel like it. Even law enforcement officers and everybody else have certain responsibilities, and they'll typically will go through some sort of review. Sometimes they'll go to trial. Sometimes they'll get convicted. Many times they won't. The point is, we can see instances where things have happened, and then subsequently, there's a decision that's made, and then now it becomes or has to be standard practice, aka Miranda law. Everybody has to be read their Miranda rights. That was the original issue, went through, was a court case, was decided, and now it's become a procedure. And I look at a lot of the stuff that's going on in the instances of, black and brown folks being shot and murdered in the street on video, and all this stuff is super visceral, and there's a lot of things that I typically probably come out and just want to say just because I just feel a certain way about that. But I also know that, we're not that far removed from the Jim Crow South. We're not that far removed from people of color having, handbooks of literally a green booklet of places where you could and could not go, places that would actually, serve you because or places that you could stay overnight, or places where there was parts of the country where you couldn't even stop at because it was just entirely too dangerous. Mm-hmm. and it was all, people from around the country basically trying to build a network to help people. And so if we don't pay attention to the fact that these things are, living, breathing testaments to how people have treated others. I'll give you, one thing, not to plug anybody's thing, but they did a whole documentary here just recently. I think it was in the last year. It was James Baldwin, and it was "I'm Not Your Negro." So you watch this. The overtones in a lot of it, centers around his perception of race and politics and the climate in America from kind of the late 60s through the mid 70s, and a lot of it encapsulates the the death of major figures, mostly Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Medgar Evers. And it ties it all back to kind of his thoughts leading up to his eventual death as well, although not but under the same series of circumstances. Long story short, it really is something, and what they did a really great job was juxtaposing things like Ferguson, things like anything else that's kind of been happening here recently, and how uniquely similar those things are. So if we're looking at the decision of Brown v. Board of Education, and then subsequent integration of schools and the actual imagery, because many of that's very similar. You see the kind of white power, white nationalist movement. You also saw the instances where they were tying together things like communism and kind of I guess it was the secondary Red Scare that they had in the 1950s leading to the 1960s, and how they were, aligning that with things like, the black or the dark, identity, so Negroes, and then how they were aligning that with, homosexuality or what we would probably more commonly refer to as, gender, normative gender politics at this point. And just showing that a lot of times it's not people telling it like it is. It's not people saying, oh, we just want to have a space just for white people. It's not about racism. It's not about sexism. It's not about this or whatever. It's just about me and my group having a space for us to do these different things. It's well, there were people of a generation, many of whom are still alive, quite frankly, who did the same kind of stuff. And if we're not learning from that, we really have to question, what are we learning from? Or are we learning anything? And is there a good way for us to be able to really disseminate or make sense of this information that's coming at us? Because there's more and more information coming at us, cell phones, computers, social media, you name it, than ever before. So ask yourself the question: how do you figure out what do you take in, what do you give away, what do you talk to people about, what do you keep yourself?
Not even just figuring out what do you take in and what do you give away, but what do you do with the stuff that you take in? Because I felt like I spent a lot of my life just taking in a bunch of different information without ever giving myself time to digest it and understanding how it affected who I was as a person, how it was kind of building me up as a person. And I've talked about this on both other podcast episodes already, about just feeling like someone else was piloting me through life. I wasn't really making any decisions for myself or really thinking deeply about the decisions that I was making. So I was just taking in all this information from a bunch of different sources, not really controlling where I was getting this information from. And then without even being conscious of it, making a bunch of different decisions that just came from I don't want to say a dark place, because I don't mean a dark place. I mean I mean dark in that I didn't know what was there. I couldn't see what was there. It was buried. So I don't know, digging through myself again, not digging through history, I can find out all those things that make me who I am. But then digging into history, I find out how we got to where we are today, and the kinds of things the kind of mistakes that we're repeating. But whereas when I dig into myself, I feel like I have a lot of power to change things. When I dig into history, I feel kind of powerless.
So maybe if I'm privy to ask a question,
please do.
Why do you, maybe in the face, and I can graph kind of my own understanding and maybe some fears on this too, but why do you maybe feel like you're powerless in the face of relative history, whatever that may be? Why do you think there's such a large difference for you between Terrence, master of his own ship, and then Terrence attempting to guide the ship that is, we'll just say, the U.S.?
it's because the ship that is the U.S. is so huge and so complex that while I know for a fact that I can affect people on like a one-to-one basis, or at least kind of influence people or learn about people or have them learn about me. It's like when it comes to the larger issues of the country and of the world, it's really hard to see your results on a large scale. So I don't know. Like, and honestly, I don't even know where I'm trying to go by saying this. I'm just sharing it. And
So then, not to cut you off, but maybe ask you a question just for framing purposes. You ever heard of a group called the Nomadness Travel Tribe?
Mm-mm.
So,
no madness.
nomad, almost like no madness, like all one word, and then Travel Tribe. So I think they probably popped up, or at least I noticed them popping up probably around about like 2011, 2012. And their whole purpose, it was started by this, African American woman on the East Coast, I believe. But anyways, their sole purpose was to be able to start to completely reframe the perception of, people, well, first African Americans, then by extension, people of color around the world. Because, and mostly Americans, like, just because, like, that general perception of, like, the African American vision and culture and everything else is, especially in America, pretty highly tied to, rap and, images of the few people or the few of us that they see on TV, or, the little bit of, things that we get from, movies, or, kind of false narratives that are portrayed out in, the news media of, instances of, violence and abject poverty and, a lot of just general ignorance. And so they basically set out to say, hey, look, if you're almost like young, sexy, and mostly black, but, definitely like a person of color for sure, we want you to get together with us. And, if you have friends, cool, bring them along. But if you don't, then you're going to have a community of people that you'd be able to travel the world with. Like, there's people basically just getting on forums and figuring out places that they want to go. And, we're just going to, like, trip by trip, break down the barriers of, of whatever. And a big
this is still going on right now?
Yep.
Where was my invite?
So so that's the other part. I will say that
black.
worth doing some research into. It's an interesting kind of invite only kind of system or whatever, mostly because they've had so much interest and they have to figure out, getting what they term as the right kind of people into the community. Everything else, they've definitely had some problematic instances, be worth kind of, viewing and reading about. But I think the soul and the essence of what they're trying to do is very noble. It's really just this semblance of this idea that there's always more than what meets the eye. You and I know that to be the case. But, like, sometimes it feels like you're kind of like a drop in the ocean. Like, I could be the greatest, smartest person in the world, but, what does it mean for me to be able to share that excellence with one individual? And then what does that mean for me to share that excellence with a small group of people? And then how does that make an impact on the billions of other people who don't encounter us on a daily basis and don't see us, for who we are, and in many cases don't view us as people that have any level of humanity? That's a lot to deal with. And so, that group in its own very interesting and sometimes selfish way sought out to try to help, solve that. So I would say it's definitely worth kind of seeing, and checking it out. I know there's been some other groups that have kind of sprouted out, off of, like, branched off of that since that time. So there's definitely a lot more of these kind of, social affinity groups, for lack of a better term, of people of color and just, young professionals and otherwise, like, going out, traveling the world, doing cool shit, like, seeing places that they probably never would have imagined or dreamed. And you know what? They're checking in from all these places. And, the locals in many of these other countries are now, in some cases, as bad as it sounds, seeing black people for the first time. But, they're getting a very rich and real perspective on just how, different and interesting that we can be. And then also, it's a lot more of a humanizing effort. It's a lot easier to see somebody as human when you actually have the ability to interact with them. It's a totally different thing to just see words on a page or characters on a screen or
stories on the news.
Yeah, and it's 10 times worse when it's just, a news story blotted across 24-hour media and there's no sound. Like, I mean, have you ever seen anything like more scary than just like watching like American like television like news when it's just like in a lobby and there's no sound playing, but like there's some like mass shooting or something crazy going on or whatever, or like one of these traffic stops that just happened or what have you. Like, it's literally just you took the voice and the soul and the essence out of that entire situation. And can you imagine what that must be like for other people who don't, who don't understand how things work here, who don't live here, who don't have the unique, instance to really take in the history that we, deal with on a daily basis.
Even extend it further, not just people that don't live here, people that don't really take the time to do that searching and understand and feel.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, I've never even thought about removing sound as like pulling the essence of soul away from it, but now that I think about it, like, fuck, that's some heavy stuff.
It's scary, man. It can be very scary. I mean, it can be interesting too, don't get me wrong. Like,
yeah, definitely.
There's a closeness that you can feel watching a really funny movie that you used to love watching or whatever, and if it's just like chilling in the background, you're like, damn, I'm glad that shit's on. Like, this is great. I remember when I laughed at that movie like a billion different times, but it's, I think I probably have had so many different things I've either read or discussions I've had with friends on, that I think the thing we were kind of centering around is a sense of other. So, and then many people very much ally that to,
What do you mean by a sense of other? Am I close enough to the mic if I sit back here? Cool. Yeah, just you might want to move it a little back. All right, cool.
So there is and I don't want
to real quick. Sorry, I keep on like I'm over here like pretending that Hugo's not sitting right there.
Yeah, right.
Like, I can't mention that there's a third person in the room.
Like, man,
Hugo producing the podcast, just putting in work over here, probably super bored. But
I know. Shout out to the homie. Be very very welcoming and all on top of the craft, man. Much appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, what were you saying?
No,
the other, like what?
Yeah,
what do you mean by
so.
the other?
There's a few different ways probably to view it, and I'll only talk from the perspective that I've gained based on like what I've experienced. But there is the academic sense of other, meaning, it's very easy for us to, even when we talk about instances of, race and politics and gender and sports. I mean, because these are typically, especially in America, like the most, controversial like topics that people typically engage in like on a fairly regular basis. And there's the one thing that is probably uniquely interesting and at the same time similar to all of those things is that there is this kind of characteristic or this sense of other that exists within that realm. So, in the case of, gender politics, so, the heteronormative versus anything else. So if we're talking about, the non-gender conforming or, the LGBTQIA community, then, now you're talking about, people not just of, physical, like what you can see, like of color or anything else, but you're also talking about, people who identify as being queer, people who identify as being trans, people who, identify as being an individual that looks to be one thing, but actually, truly feels that they were a person that was born into not the appropriate, gender role for their body. So it gets into a lot of things, but in the case of gender specifically, we're talking about everybody, kind of the collective everybody, right? Like takes on that, yes, like heterosexuality is the top of the, top of the food chain, effectively. Most people refer to it in that way. Most things and laws and the books and everything else in society benefits people to be in a heteronormative relationship. And then from there, there's all those things that kind of sit naturally below it for whatever reason. And it's different. Some of that starts with just homosexuality, which is just, two people that already identify to be a part of a particular gender that's already accepted, except for they choose to have a partner that, or, they are in love in some cases with somebody who just so happens to be a part of the same sex. People have an issue with that. Why do they have an issue with that? That's that sense of other, this thing that people cannot connect with directly. And they don't have a great way to be able to meet out in their brains, or even in some cases they can think about it one-on-one, but they can't necessarily express or make sense of those feelings publicly. So with their circle of influence, whether that's their spouse, their family, their friends, everything else. So it becomes this, thing that's allied to another place that they can't conceivably go in a comfortable way. I think it's almost, too easy to be able to say, to have this continual dark and light conversation that people typically have with things that they like or don't like. And there's a much bigger conversation aligned with, like, why is white or lightness, having to do with the, things that are good, and then darkness has to do with things that are bad. And I mean, that's a whole other 2-hour podcast, like unto itself. But the point is that there's this sense of other, and now you can, start pacing it out to a bunch of other, key hot button issues. Race ends up being another one. Poverty ends up being, or the, the actual significance of having wealth, or the absence of that, being something to talk about. And people who typically have that talking point, especially in the case of economics and money, of saying, oh, well, we believe in fiscal conservatism and people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. It's like, well, it's very easy coming from somebody who already has a sense of wealth currently. It doesn't matter whether they started there and eventually got there by some sort of way. It's just how they talk about it.
Yeah, and just as you're saying that, I understand now what you mean by the concept of the other, and how the people that are on, I don't even like using the people that are on top, but that's just kind of the analogy we set up. It's like they are the ones, like anybody that's part of the other has to fight to have a voice. And it's like the people that probably need to be heard the most to make up some kind of deficit are the ones that have to fight the hardest to have a voice. It's really interesting to me. And well, I'm just thinking about this now in real time, but like, have you found the instances of that feeling of the other where the other is actually the majority, like based on like shared number of people?
So if I'm understanding, meaning like feeling out of place even when,
I just realized like that would financially, like there are fewer people that are super wealthy and stuff, but they have the largest voice. And but then I guess it goes both ways. Like the wealthy look at the poorer people as the other, and the poorer people look at the wealthy as the other.
Sure. I mean, it's not for me to completely affix or say that there's one way to look at it. And I think most of these paradigms are designed to be able to flip them on their heads and still work perfectly fine. But yeah, I think, a lot of times, especially if you're thinking about a sense or an absence of a certain quality and how that directly, affects other individuals, i.e. like, okay, well, the absence of money, how does that affect people? Well, people can't afford stuff. People can't, they can't feed their kids, they can't pay their rent, or they don't have a place to stay, or, they can't or won't go on vacation. And, they typically, in the absence of having actual wealth, which also is a slightly different conversation, but, they typically don't have the best jobs, or maybe they do, but they're drowning in debt and they don't really have a way to balance that. And there's a lot of things that kind of come up with a wealthy person's perception on people who have less, which is the majority of, the relative community, so the United States in this case. So the majority of U.S. citizens don't have a whole lot. It's all that money and influence and everything else is all kind of situated in a very small pocket amongst, a very small group of people. And so naturally, that small group is typically going to, they got there because they were doing things that were very advantageous to them and the other subsequent individuals within that small group of people. And they're probably going to continue utilizing that power and influence to continue doing all the things that are, great for them and that small group of people and whoever else that they have come along, their progenies or their, descendants or however you want to, term that. And so, yeah, man, I mean, it's wild. And it's tough because I think the other part too, like even not even just thinking in terms of money, but like there's a very interesting like for personal experience, there's an experience that I had growing up, going to, predominantly white institutions and having that feeling of others as basically being the daily reminder that you are the only or one of a few, black kids specifically, but more generally people of color. And then when I went to college, and I still went to college, predominantly white university, but I was also super close to one of the biggest and most renowned like HBCUs in the country, which is Howard University, which is in Washington D.C., and spent a lot of time with people that were going to Howard, and spent more time at Howard as a consequence of that, and still realizing that it's very interesting, even when you're in a space where the majority of people look or identify in the same way that you do, but now the fishbowl is obviously much larger. So you're thinking about the larger world, or in that case, a larger city, because we're all college students. So it's like, okay, well, most of us aren't taking over the world just yet. Like, we have to be considerate of what's going on in D.C. And, D.C. for the longest time, Chocolate City, predominantly black.
You said Chocolate City?
No, I'm serious. Like, D.C. would call it Chocolate City forever. Yeah. So, I mean, okay, to throw it out there, rest in peace, Marion Barry. One of the prolific mayors and now former city council persons of Washington, D.C., changed much of the landscape for people in D.C. I'm not going to go through this long laundry list of people that would be very easy to pick out. Dave Chappelle from D.C., Martin Lawrence from D.C., Kevin Durant, he's from the DMV, so the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area. My point is, there's all sorts of different, figures that are aligned to, the District of Columbia, so Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. And it was mostly like predominantly black for the longest time. Like people, went there for all sorts of different, things. There's, the historic U Street, which is where there was tons of, black businesses and things that are aligned to, Afrocentricity and and everything else. And then, there's Ben's Chili Bowl, which is a black-owned, business that's world-renowned and is still there. And, there's a lot of stuff that just all kind of, comes together. So, I could see how it would come across as just kind of being like a joke, or whatever. But
even if it makes perfect sense, calling the place Chocolate City is funny.
But that was it's still. It's not really in the strictest sense of the word Chocolate City anymore, because they've moved most of the people of color out of like DC proper at this point. But it's still a nickname. People still identify with that. Sorry, everybody.
So you were talking about going to a predominantly white school, but also spending a lot of time in a predominantly black neighborhood. Did that have something to do with you dropping out that first time?
No. I probably had more, things going on just personally that had to do with, family and, so my sister is about 18 years younger than me. So we have a large...
Do you have a sister?
Yeah, I have a sister. She is just about to start high school, actually. So, but she was born during my first week in college, and born in about 3, almost 4 months premature. So the whole thing had a bunch of surgeries, had tubes running in and out of her, the whole deal, and they weren't confident that she would walk. Even if she could walk, she wouldn't be able to walk unassisted. And that she'd probably have a problem speaking, and even if she could speak, it would take years for her to get there, and that she'd be slow to develop, and all this litany of different things. So even after all the surgery and all that stuff happened, and she did eventually have to, when she was a little bit older as a toddler, had to have a speech pathologist come in and an audiologist come out and work with her, but she had little to no issues, and if you saw her today, you'd never know, because most kids that are born that premature also have a very physical look to them where you can tell, and she just doesn't carry that. So, mom calls her the miracle baby and everything else. But long story short, mom had some complications. She was much older. She was 40 when she had my sister. So, a lot harder of a pregnancy to have, and just it was just a tough time. Tough to be that far away from, my family and everything else that was going on. And there's a lot of back and forth that we did during the time I was in college. And also, was between 18 and 21 years old. Like, I was just being stupid, quite frankly, like most of the time, just stupid and lazy and chasing girls and, doing all sorts
You're
of
being stupid. You're being 18.
yeah, well, 18, 19, 20, 21. Like, I definitely could have
Stop counting.
Yeah, I know.
You are married now.
Well, I mean, I could have learned a lot more during that time. And in some cases, just the experience of learning. And in other cases, I just didn't want to, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, but you know what? Helped me be the person I am now. I mean, I told you this before. Went a lot of places, saw a lot of things, dated a lot of people, and I'm better for it now.
Yeah.
Because I know the shit that I don't need to be involved in. And I was able to not pick up a lot of bad habits. I didn't really drink until I was 21, quite frankly.
Really?
So I didn't, and I basically have never done any real intense drugs either. So, I mean, I don't know. You tell me. I didn't do the school thing right, but I did a bunch of other stuff. Okay. I'll just say. I won't say I did it right because I don't know. I'm a firm believer in there's a right and wrong.
Yeah,
for
I was going to say,
everything.
what's right or wrong? It's your life. You
Exactly.
do what you want.
Right. You fuck it up, or you can, knock it out of the ballpark, or you can just figure it out day by day. I like to think I just figured it out day by day.
Yeah. So, how long were you out when you dropped out?
I was only out for maybe about a year and a half.
Was the goal always to go back?
Oh, for sure. I think that I had seen too many people, whether they were in my family or just general sphere of influence, not finish school, drop out, and not go back. And I will attest as much as anybody else will. Every year that you spend outside of like a structured environment like that, like going to school, it becomes that much harder to, to re-ingratiate yourself. Because like it's more than just saying like, oh, I'm going to sign up for classes and I'm going to do all this stuff or whatever, and then I'm going to get my degree. It's the semblance that like your life and many of the people that you also aligned yourself with have now moved on. There's also, if I'm being honest, there's a small sense of shame of like not having finished some of the things that you had set out to do in the time frame that you originally had planned it. So, it's easy for me now at 32 to say, well, all plans, go out the window. At some point, you just kind of make moves and deal with it. But like, that's me talking from the perspective of a person who's actually had to make those moves and has adapted. At that time, I wasn't that person. I thought the worst piece of adversity that I had faced, other than just general racism in America, like, was what the hell am I going to eat at the cafeteria today? Like, there's other social and personal things I dealt with, but in terms of like actual like structured, like, is there a barrier in front of me, like keeping me from being able to accomplish something? That was the first test, if you will, that I ever really had. And it was also the instance where, I had to convince somebody to let me back into school. And at first they actually told me no. They're like, you know what? We get where you're coming from, but you basically failed out. Like, we're not going to take you right away. But I'll never forget. And it's sad because I got the lady's paperwork somewhere. I forget her name right off the top of my head. But I went in to try to get back into school at DePaul University in Chicago after I moved to Illinois with my parents here from California and everything else. And I ended up talking to this lady at admissions, and she's a black lady. She had to be in her like early 40s probably. And I went through the whole process, interviewed, all that stuff, and of course you get to the point where like, gulp, I gotta explain why my transcript is really, really bad and why I didn't finish my degree at my previous institution. And I gave her my whole story, background, everything else. And, I probably gave her the same song and dance that every other prospective kid, wants to give them about why this is going to be the time that I'm really going to knock it out of the ballpark and make stuff happen. And I'll never forget her telling me that she's like, this alone is enough for us to basically just tell you no. Like, I mean, we pretty much are going to have to wash out your application at this point. You're not in, she's like, because the big part of it is that you're not in good standing with your previous, like, degree seeking institution. She's like, so that's one of the hidden things we kind of have to have on paper for you to be able to come and get a degree from our institution. She goes, but she's like, there's plenty of kids for a lot of different reasons that either don't make it or have difficulties or whatever the case may be. And, you know, firm believer in people kind of turning things around. She goes, so she's like, this is what I would encourage you to do. Like, we're 100% not going to accept you. She says, I'm not going to deny you outright. I'm just going to push off your application. What I'll ask you to do is to go ahead and go to, you know, the local community college, take, you know, as close to a full course load as you can, get A's in all those classes, come back, bring the transcript, go through the process again, you know, the whole thing to sit and interview and all that stuff or whatever, and we'll see. I'll see if I can, you know, help kind of sway the committee and see if we'll, you know, get you reinstated and let you back in. And sure enough, you know, I went, scraped up, I was already working, so I didn't have to scrape a bunch of money, but I scraped up some money. I went, took about, it's like 4 or 5, like, you know, junior college, like, classes or whatever, and just got all A's, knocked them out of the ballpark, like, you know, the whole deal. Really, at that time, actually learned how to work with people and to focus and to study and, you know, how to balance my time, unlike what I had done when I was younger. Mind you, I was, you know, 23 years old, so it wasn't like, you know, 23, 24, so it wasn't like, you know, big, huge hurdle to jump over. I was like so much older than I was when I went to college originally.
But you learned a lot in that.
Yeah, that short period of time. And so then came back and went through the whole thing and sat there sweating bullets, not knowing if they were going to accept me or whatever. And then I got, you know, email saying, hey, you know, need you to come down so we can have another conversation. And I'm like, okay, I figured it's just part of the process. And, you know, sure enough, she just wanted to deliver the good news in person, basically saying, hey, you know, just wanted to let you know we were able to get it figured out. Really glad that you took all this stuff really seriously. And, you know, congratulations and welcome, you know, just whatever. Now, the joke was still on me because I was thinking I literally was a semester away from getting my degree the first time around. So I'm thinking, oh, I'm just going to go in there, one more semester, I'm going to knock this out, and then, you know, I'm going to be on my way. I'll only be deferred just a little bit. I'll be 24. I'll be super close behind, you know, all my peers, like whatever, and I'll just be right back on track. Joke was on me. Apparently, they have this little thing called residency that you have to establish at the university, basically a minimum amount of credits that you have to earn at that school before they'll give you a degree. So I actually, instead of being there for a semester, I ended up being there for like a year and a half. So I had to go through like 3 semesters and then some summer school stuff too. But yeah, I got my degree finally.
What was really different about that second? I know you said you were more focused and learned to work with more people. Like, what motivated you to be that much different? Because you had to work for it to get in there, or you had to do all that extra work? Or
you know what? It's funny. And I'll use the actual experience of going to school as the example of why I feel like I was probably more successful like this time around. So I lived in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, and this, like, the school that I went to was actually like right in the heart of the city of Chicago. So anyway, it's probably about close to 40 miles one way. So I got to make the 40 miles in to go and get to school and all that stuff. And then I got to, at some point, whenever I'm done my classes, I got to make the 40 miles back out to go home. So it was literally about 10, 12 miles to drive from my parents' house to the train station. I'd sit there, wait for the train. Take the train. Train takes about, 30, 35 minutes in the morning, hour in the evening, because I'd catch an express train coming in, and then I'd have to catch 2 buses, and then I had to walk about a half mile. So I would do this probably about, it was twice a week. So I get up at, 5 something in the morning so I could get ready. No, I take that back. I actually get up probably like around like 4 something, 4:30 in the morning. I get ready. I'd leave my house just a little bit before 6, get there, do the whole train thing, all that stuff or whatever. So that way, like, I could start my classes at 8 o'clock in the morning. I would have classes from 8 in the morning, and my last class would end at 8 at night. And then I'd catch the second to last train coming from the city back out to the suburbs, get my car, and I'd be home by around like 10. So, you can imagine how many hours that is just in terms of like getting back and forth. And that was twice a week. And then every other day that I didn't have class, I was working. So literally Monday through Sunday, every week for a year and a half, I was just working, going to school, working, going to school, working, going to school. But it was literally that time. In Chicago, it gets cold.
So I've heard.
and windy and snow and crap and all this other stuff that you got to go through. You got to scrape off your car. You got to do all this stuff. I think it was that actual like exercise of doing that like the first time. So that first fall into winter, that I would actually do that whole routine of getting up early, and it's at some point getting up super early, because I actually figured out that by the time I was getting home at like 10 o'clock at night and between working, I didn't really have, the mental fortitude or even the energy to be able to do my homework. So I actually figured out that, I can go to sleep early, or as early as I can, like when I get home or after work or whatever. And then I could get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I could read my prompts, write my papers, do my homework. They didn't really give you homework, but do my assignments effectively, and then whatever else that needed to be tightened up or anything like that, I could do on the train. So either my train ride there or back, or if I was super tired, I could sleep a little bit on the train ride heading back out to the suburbs. And it was in that time between that and paying that bill to go to school that kind of helped me get around to like figuring out, I really need to get this stuff together. It was that, and also it was, and kind of a last thing, it had nothing to do with anything that had to do with me, but felt super self-conscious because at that time, by the time I got there, I was 24, and by the time I finished, I was 25. So I ended up having, and I forget her name too, but like I ended up having classes with this girl, God, beautiful girl, but I just remember she
Watch
had.
it, man.
But I told my wife about this. It's fine. But I just remember like she had these tattoos on the front of her forearm, and it was basically from about wrist area down to the elbow, and it was peacock feathers, really ornate, super beautiful. And we had maybe like 3 classes together before we were sitting one time like between the classes changing or whatever, and I ended up asking her a question just, in the vein of, excuse me, just in the vein of trying to get additional things about the prompt or whatever. And mind you, I wouldn't think, like, I was dating my wife at this time, and I wasn't thinking about doing anything else because I was also super tired every day. So I was just, like, really focused on, like, oh, I need to be here. And there was a certain level of embarrassment that kind of came with, like, I'm around a lot of people that are not that much younger than me, but, like, a little bit younger and still, like, in school for the first time. And meanwhile, I'm working and like going back to school and all this other stuff, and I'm just like, man, I don't want any of these people to see me, know how old I am. I just need to finish, get out of here. And so I ended up getting over that general level of fear, and just finally asked her a quick question. She just so happened to have the answer, and we ended up just kind of talking, just cordially, just a little bit, just between classes here and there. But a few weeks later, it was closing in on my birthday, and so I was like, oh, whatever, just having general conversation. And then I was like, yeah, well, any plans for the weekend? And I was like, yeah, I'm going to go celebrate, do some stuff for, my birthday. She says, oh, yeah, my birthday's coming up too. And I'm like, what? Like, so, like, when's your birthday? And then she goes, oh, my birthday's February 12th. That just so happens to be my birthday. I was like, get out of here. And then she's like, you serious? You have the same birthday? I'm like, yeah. And then I was like, all right, now you're pulling my leg, like, or whatever, right? And then I was like, okay, so how old are you? And she goes, oh, she's like, I'll be turning 25. I was like, me too. And then I'm like, all right, you're now like, you're really pulling my leg. From my lips to God's ears, or however that's supposed to work. She pulls out her driver's license, slams it on the table. Sure enough, February 12th, 1985. Same birthday to the day as me. And it was one of those, I think that was the final thing that it took for me to realize that the level of kind of fear and uncertainty and shame and everything else that kind of went around with this whole weird, interesting, cyclical journey I had taken from being in school and young and dumb and not knowing what to do and all this other stuff in the world and whatever, had now suddenly come around to realizing there was another individual literally not just like me, because no one's just like me, just like I'm not just like anyone else, but someone who shared the same birth date and just so happened to be in the same place at the same time. And that's a big part of what like made me realize, okay, now I'm really good with being able to own like where I'm at. She's good with it, I can be good with it. She can do it, I can do it. Why not? And now I'm here today. So it doesn't tie together super cleanly. That's probably not nearly as bad as you thought it was going to be when you thought I started talking about another woman.
All right. Now that's interesting. That sounds like that was a real struggle, like being, and not even that much older, not even that much more delayed or anything.
I mean, if I look back at it now, it doesn't seem like anything. But at the time, it was everything. Yeah. It was just like, a lot of my friends were already 2-3 years deep into like these really cool and interesting careers, and like they were already traveling the world, and they were living with different people, and doing all this stuff while I was in my parents' spare bedroom in Illinois.
That's exactly why you can't really discount anyone's struggle, because that might not seem like that big of a deal to someone, but it was clearly a big deal to you, and it was affecting you a shitload. And it's like, that's interesting. Like, I would have never known that if I didn't ask you about it right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy. So, way back in the beginning, you talked about John Locke and how he kind of set us up for the kind of educational system we have now. And also, it seemed like it was super important for you to finish college and get your degree. So you must have seen through growing up as a black man in America and dealing with racism and stuff, you must have seen that education is a super important part of empowerment. Is that what led you to your path? Because I know you've been working in some form of the education space for years now. So,
yeah, I mean, especially in terms of like me, the individual sitting in front of you here today. I mean, my wife is an educator. She's been in education for almost a decade now. Most of that being a teacher. The last 2 years has been assistant principal. And yeah, I would tell you that, education, it's so simple to say like education is paramount, fucking reading Rainbow and everything else. Like it's important, but I think the thing that typically like stands out like even more as being about the black experience and thinking about, different things that we're supposed to take away from that. So if you look at somebody like a Ta-Nehisi Coates, or you look at a, Professor, Michael Eric Dyson, who's a professor at Georgetown, or you look at, a figure like Cornel West, or you look at, Henry Louis Gates Jr. Like I'm mentioning all of these, they just so happen to be like black male individuals who are, intellectuals and, have a form or a place not only in the conversation of like race and politics in America, but specifically in education, because like that's probably one of the things that they all share. They're all professors, basically. So the point is that it's so important to like, especially as a black man who went and was fortunate enough to go to college and gain more than a nominal amount of education, and to realize what sort of impact that has. Because it affords me not just the opportunity to be able to have better generalized experiences and better instances to where I can have a job that would help to now do what I'm doing now, which is support my family, but it also gives me, it creates a bridge for me to be able to like actually get to certain places. I've met many different people in many different walks of life, but I probably met a lot more of those people specifically because I went to school and was highly educated. And that's not to say that somebody who didn't go to formalized schooling or didn't go to a liberal arts college or anything else or whatever can't do or amass any of those things. It's actually completely the contrary. But it's really just more so that like it actually helps me to better understand how my existence and my station in life, especially by comparison to, the majority, which, for a very fleeting moment right now is still white people in this country, how that affects others and how, we kind of lay out in the middle of that. And what is going to happen next, and to be able to answer the core question of, like, what do I mean in the grand scheme of, this American experiment, as many people have kind of termed it. Where do I fit? How much control do I have? Are there things that I need to be aware of that other people, don't need to be aware of, don't care about? I feel like I've been fairly informed in a lot of those things. Mm-hmm. But, it doesn't just stop there. Continues with us having conversations about this, continues with you having conversations like this, but with people who are not, of the same ilk or background or persons of color or whatever. It all comes together, and it still all goes back to that semblance of, what does history teach us? It teaches us that there were other people that were here before us that went out and made several different decisions and arrived at several different results, many of which, and the difference between, say, like a very hard-coded thing like science and a thing like history, which, quite frankly, science has its own history, but history of society and politics and everything else will continue to echo throughout the ages, but we have the ability to change those things as we see there being a better need or more of a fit to change how that affects a larger group. So you're not going to go around and change physics anytime soon. I'm not saying that you couldn't, but you're probably not going to go change, the way that gravity functions anytime soon. You can change the way that, you see somebody walking down the street and catcalling. We can change the fact that somebody doesn't need to spray paint nigger on LeBron James's house. We can change the fact that, despite all the stuff that we've said about, the water and lead crisis in Flint, that most of that shit still isn't fixed. There's a bunch of stuff that's very much like, aligned or, centered with race and culture that we actually have the ability to affect change, not just more instantaneously than some other things, but in a very direct way. Like, it's just us holding on to certain ideals and semblances of power, and whether or not we're willing to expand or give up some of that to kind of come together and create a better society. Some people just don't want to do that. And they've got a lot of different reasons why they don't want to do that, but some people just don't want to. And some people have reasons that they don't want to do it specifically because it'll be to their personal detriment. They'd have to give up something to be able to get that.
And some people don't want to do it, or it's not even that they don't want to do it. Some people just don't know how. And I would say that was my case for most of my life. But like I said, instead of attacking all these problems that I thought were too big for me to make a difference, I just turned in and started, making change internally. And if you don't have a clear path to make change externally, you can always turn inside and fix yourself. And in my experience so far, that affects everyone around you too. So make a change.
I know, man. And I'm glad you feel that way. Because I think this is an extension of a conversation you and I had a couple days ago. But like, it starts with you. You don't have like I said, you don't have Terrence together. Damn all the rest of that. Like, it doesn't, like, you can't help and or teach anyone else until you have been able to affect that change within yourself and really understand how that affects who you are, and then subsequently would be able to be of benefit to others. Because how the hell are you gonna help somebody else when you can't help yourself?
Exactly. Well, there are like a million other things I want to ask you, but I think that's a
little late.
Good... Come on, old man. No,
Damn.
I'm just saying that I feel like that's a good place to stop. Like, you can make a change, no matter how small, no matter external or internal. Like, you can do something. So
I can dig that, man.
Cool, man. As always, you guys can find me at Terrence Davey on Instagram or buffnerdla.com. Anything you want to shout out?
Shout out to my wife Michelle. She loves and hates
Smart
me
man.
all at the same time. So when and if she ever hears this, love you. Also love my son Andrew. I'm not gonna continue to sit out here and shout out like this is a 1998 mixtape. So yeah, y'all, we can just probably go ahead and cut it here. And I'm not giving out social because I don't post nearly enough for anybody to be interested enough to follow me. So I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for coming, man.